The evening began in the same gentle way as so many others on Ravenscroft Lane, with a soft, patient rain falling steadily since late afternoon, as though London itself were slowly breathing through layers of mist and cloud. Along the narrow street, gas lamps glowed with warm, golden light, their reflections trembling quietly in shallow puddles, while beyond the glass of our sitting room window, the world appeared distant and dreamlike, softened by fog and rain into blurred shapes and muted colors. Inside, everything rested in calm balance. The fireplace murmured with low, steady flames, sending slow-moving shadows across tall bookshelves lined with worn leather volumes and carefully preserved journals, while the familiar scent of old paper, tea leaves, and polished wood settled gently in the air, creating an atmosphere that invited both thought and rest. I sat in my usual chair near the window, watching the street in silence, allowing my thoughts to drift without direction, carried only by the rhythm of rain and fire, and by the quiet certainty that nothing urgent awaited us on this particular night. Across the room, Edmund Blackwood occupied his high-backed armchair, angled slightly toward the hearth, with a thin blanket resting over his knees and a leather-bound notebook closed upon the small table beside him, untouched for several hours. One gloved hand rested loosely upon the arm of the chair, while the other held a porcelain teacup that had long since cooled, though he seemed entirely unaware of it. He had remained in that position for so long that his stillness appeared almost part of the room itself, as natural and unchanging as the shelves or the mantelpiece. To an unfamiliar visitor, such immobility might have suggested weariness or distraction, yet experience had taught me that these moments marked the deepest concentration of his mind, when countless impressions gathered quietly beneath the surface of calm. During those hours, he absorbed the smallest disturbances of the world around us, storing them patiently until their meaning revealed itself. That evening, however, there seemed to be nothing unusual to absorb. No hurried footsteps passed beneath our window. No raised voices drifted through the mist. No restless movements disturbed the quiet rhythm of the street. Only the steady fall of rain, the soft breathing of the fire, and the measured ticking of the clock upon the mantel. I reached for my teacup and took a slow sip, feeling the warmth spread gently through my chest, and allowing myself to appreciate the rare simplicity of such peaceful hours, knowing from experience how seldom they remained undisturbed for long. Somewhere far away, a distant train whistle briefly touched the air before fading into silence, leaving the night unchanged. It was then that a faint sound reached us. At first, it blended so naturally with the whisper of rain and wind that it barely registered within my awareness, yet when it returned, slightly clearer and more deliberate, I recognized it as the careful knock of a visitor at our front door. The sound was neither hurried nor uncertain, but measured and restrained, as though its author wished to announce presence without imposing urgency. Before I could rise from my chair, Edmund stirred. With deliberate precision, he lowered his teacup onto the table, adjusted his posture almost imperceptibly, and lifted his gaze from the flames toward the ceiling, tracing the vibration of the knock through the structure of the house. He listened, not with curiosity, but with focused attention. A second knock followed, firm yet polite, confirming that the interruption was intentional rather than accidental. I stood and made my way toward the stairway, moving carefully so as not to disturb the fragile calm that still lingered in the room, while the familiar creak of each step echoed softly beneath my feet. By the time I reached the landing, Edmund had already risen and taken his place near the desk by the window, where a small lamp now cast a pool of amber light across polished wood and neatly arranged papers. Descending the remaining steps, I opened the front door and was greeted by cool air and drifting mist. A man stood upon the threshold, dressed plainly but neatly, with traces of rain upon his coat and the unmistakable weariness of long sleepless nights visible in his eyes. In his hands, he held a cream-colored envelope sealed with dark red wax and marked by no identifying symbol. Without hesitation or ceremony, he extended it toward me. I accepted it, and he responded with a brief nod before turning and disappearing into the fog, his figure dissolving almost instantly into rain and shadow. Closing the door, I returned to the sitting room and placed the envelope upon the desk before Edmund. He regarded it in silence for several moments, studying its texture, weight, and faint scent, as though each detail carried potential meaning. Only after this quiet examination did he lift it between gloved fingers and break the seal. The paper unfolded with a soft whisper. He read the contents slowly, then once more, and again, each reading deepening his concentration rather than satisfying it. When he finally set the letter aside, his gaze drifted toward the window, where fog and lamplight continued their silent dance. In that moment, it became clear that the stillness of the evening had been gently but irrevocably altered, not by noise or disturbance, but by the arrival of a question that had found its way, with deliberate care, to Ravenscroft Lane. A new mystery had entered our lives, and it had chosen its moment with quiet precision. For several minutes after Edmund finished reading the letter, neither of us spoke nor moved, as though the quiet of the room itself required time to adjust to the presence of something new and unresolved. The rain continued its steady rhythm against the windows, and the fire maintained its gentle murmur, yet beneath these familiar sounds, I sensed a subtle shift, an almost imperceptible tension that had entered our surroundings alongside the folded sheet of paper resting upon the desk. Edmund remained standing near the lamp, his tall figure partially illuminated by its warm glow, while the rest of him blended softly into shadow, creating the impression of a man suspended between clarity and mystery. His gaze lingered upon the letter, though his eyes no longer followed its written lines, but rather the invisible pathways of thought that now occupied his attention. I returned to my chair and settled into it quietly, observing him without intrusion, having learned over time that his reflections unfolded best when left undisturbed. In such moments, he appeared almost detached from the physical world, as though his presence remained in the room while his mind wandered through distant corridors of logic and memory. At length he moved. With careful precision, he gathered the envelope and the letter, aligning their edges before placing them within his notebook, which he then closed with gentle finality, as if sealing away not merely paper, but possibility. He crossed slowly toward the window, where fog pressed softly against the glass, blurring the distant glow of street lamps into pale halos of light. There, he stood for some time, hands folded behind his back, observing the shifting patterns of mist as though they held answers hidden within their movement. From where I sat, I could see his reflection faintly mirrored in the window pane, merged with shadows and drifting light, forming an image that seemed both present and unreal. It reminded me, not for the first time, how naturally he belonged to this quiet world of half-light and unanswered questions. Eventually, he returned to the desk and drew out the letter once more. This time, he did not read it in full, but rather allowed his eyes to travel selectively across certain lines, pausing briefly at specific passages before continuing onward. I recognized this behavior as the mark of deeper analysis, when first impressions had given way to more deliberate examination. While he studied the page, I found myself reflecting upon the curious path that had led me to Ravenscroft Lane. Years earlier, I had sought nothing more than a quiet residence and modest companionship, yet gradually I had become witness to countless stories, each unfolding with subtle complexity and quiet consequence. Through it all, Edmund had remained unchanged in manner, steady in temperament, and unwavering in his devotion to truth, even when that truth arrived wrapped in uncertainty. On this night, however, there was something different in his posture, something more restrained than usual, as though the letter carried not only information, but a burden of responsibility. The clock upon the mantel marked another quarter hour, its measured chime dissolving gently into the surrounding silence. Outside, the rain softened further, descending now in a delicate mist that shimmered briefly beneath lamplight before vanishing into darkness. At last, Edmund returned the letter to its place and seated himself opposite me, though his attention remained inward, fixed upon thoughts not yet ready for expression. He reached for his teacup, now long since cold, and took a slow sip without apparent awareness of its temperature, suggesting that physical comfort had yielded entirely to contemplation. I observed the familiar signs of preparation, the gradual alignment of perception and purpose that always preceded his engagement with a new inquiry. There was no urgency in these movements, no trace of haste or agitation, only the quiet gathering of resolve. As minutes passed, I began to sense that the letter's true significance lay not in its explicit content, but in what it left unsaid, in the spaces between words where intention and fear often resided. Such omissions, I had learned, frequently proved more revealing than detailed confession. When Edmund finally raised his gaze, it was directed not toward me, but toward the bookshelf near the fireplace, where several volumes of past cases rested in orderly succession. For a moment, his eyes traced their spines, as though acknowledging silent companions from earlier chapters of our lives. Then, slowly, his attention returned to the present. He opened his notebook and began to write, his pen moving in smooth, deliberate lines across the page, recording impressions that existed nowhere else but within his mind. The scratching of metal upon paper blended softly with rain and fire, forming a gentle rhythm that seemed to anchor the room once more in calm. Watching him work, I felt the familiar mixture of anticipation and tranquility that accompanied the opening stages of every investigation. There was comfort in knowing that, whatever uncertainties lay ahead, they would be approached with patience rather than force, with reflection rather than haste. The night outside continued its quiet vigil, unaware that within our modest sitting room, the first foundations of another story were being carefully laid. A story shaped not by sudden drama or loud confrontation, but by observation, memory, and the slow unfolding of hidden truths. When morning arrived, it did so without ceremony, easing quietly into the city as though reluctant to disturb the fragile calm left behind by the night. The rain had ceased shortly before dawn, leaving the streets washed clean and glistening beneath a pale, silvery light that filtered through lingering mist. From my window, I observed how fog drifted slowly between buildings, dissolving the sharp lines of stone and brick into softened shapes that appeared almost unreal. Within our rooms, the air retained a gentle warmth from the dying embers of the fireplace, which now glowed faintly beneath a layer of ash. The scent of cooled smoke mingled with fresh morning air, creating an atmosphere both familiar and quietly renewed. I rose early, as was my habit, and prepared tea with careful attention, allowing the water to heat gradually while the kettle released its soft, rhythmic murmur. The slow rituals of morning had always provided comfort, particularly on days that promised uncertainty. When I returned to the sitting room, Edmund was already awake. He stood near the desk, examining several open volumes that lay arranged in precise order, their pages marked with narrow strips of paper and delicate pencil notes in the margins. Sunlight, still weak and uncertain, fell across his shoulders and illuminated strands of silver within his dark hair, revealing signs of time that he rarely seemed to acknowledge. His coat rested neatly upon the back of a chair, and his scarf lay folded beside it, suggesting that he had begun his work long before the city stirred. Without interrupting his concentration, I placed a tray with 2 cups of tea upon the small table and seated myself nearby, content to observe the quiet industry that now filled the room. Edmund moved between books and desk with measured precision, comparing passages, tracing references, and recording brief observations in his notebook, each action performed with calm deliberation. There was no trace of haste in his movements, nor any sign of fatigue, despite the brevity of his rest. It was during such mornings that I most clearly perceived the depth of his commitment, for while others sought renewal in sleep, he found it in thought. As the light gradually strengthened, the street below began to awaken. Distant footsteps echoed softly against stone. A delivery cart passed with restrained rumbling. Somewhere nearby, a shopkeeper raised metal shutters with careful restraint. Life resumed its gentle rhythm. Yet within our sitting room, attention remained fixed upon matters invisible to passers-by. After some time, Edmund gathered several pages of notes and arranged them neatly before him, studying them with the same calm intensity he had applied to the letter the previous evening. His gaze moved slowly across each line, pausing occasionally, not in hesitation, but in consideration. I sensed that he was tracing patterns still too faint for others to perceive, assembling fragments of meaning into tentative structure. When he finally closed the books and returned them to their shelves, he did so with quiet satisfaction, as though acknowledging that preliminary foundations had been laid. He then seated himself near the window and gazed outward for several minutes, allowing his thoughts to settle. Outside, sunlight now penetrated the thinning fog, revealing rooftops and chimneys emerging gradually from shadow. The city, refreshed by rain, appeared composed and untroubled, unaware of the uncertainties that lingered beneath its surface. I reflected then upon how often appearances deceived, how frequently tranquility concealed unresolved tensions, waiting patiently for attentive minds to uncover them. Edmund rose once more and retrieved his coat, examining it briefly before placing it over his shoulders. He adjusted his scarf with habitual care and selected a pair of gloves from the small drawer beside the desk, sliding them on with deliberate precision. These preparations, subtle and unremarkable in themselves, signaled that his reflections had reached provisional conclusion. The time for observation beyond our walls had arrived. He gathered his notebook and placed it securely within his coat, ensuring its position with gentle pressure, as though confirming the presence of an indispensable companion. For a moment, he stood motionless near the doorway, surveying the room that had served as both refuge and workshop throughout countless investigations. Then, with quiet resolve, he opened the door and stepped into the corridor, leaving behind the warmth of hearth and familiarity. I followed soon after, pausing briefly to extinguish the remaining embers and to ensure that windows and shelves were in order, small acts of closure that marked the transition from reflection to engagement. Descending the stairs, I sensed that we were entering the early stages of a journey whose destination remained uncertain, guided less by certainty than by attentive curiosity. Outside, the morning greeted us with cool air and soft light. Fog lingered at street level, drifting lazily between buildings, while distant bells marked the hour with subdued resonance. Ravenscroft Lane stretched before us, quiet and composed, offering no hint of the questions that awaited beyond its boundaries. Yet I knew, as I always did in such moments, that beneath this calm surface, hidden narratives were already unfolding, ready to reveal themselves to those patient enough to listen. We walked in unhurried silence along Ravenscroft Lane, allowing the quiet rhythm of morning to guide our pace, while mist continued to drift lazily between buildings and soften the outlines of doors, windows, and distant rooftops. The city, newly washed by rain, appeared composed and reflective, as though pausing briefly before resuming its usual momentum, and in that interval of calm, even familiar streets seemed subtly transformed. Edmund moved with his customary restraint, his steps measured and balanced, neither hurried nor hesitant, while his gaze traveled calmly across surroundings that might have seemed unremarkable to others. Every doorway, every shutter, every faint trace of movement received equal attention, not through obvious scrutiny, but through quiet awareness. We proceeded eastward, passing modest shops and narrow courtyards, until the architecture gradually shifted into wider avenues lined with taller residences and carefully maintained gardens. Weatherby Crescent soon revealed itself as a gentle curve of stately townhouses, their pale stone facades reflecting softened sunlight and lending the street an air of restrained elegance. Low iron fences bordered small front gardens where trimmed hedges and early spring flowers rested beneath lingering droplets of rain. The atmosphere of the Crescent suggested stability and discretion, qualities often prized by those who sought distance from public notice. Our destination lay near the far end of the curve. Number 27 stood quietly among its neighbors, its windows shuttered halfway and its entrance framed by two narrow columns darkened slightly by age. A brass plate beside the door bore a name that had been partially polished away by time and touch, rendering its inscription faint but still legible. Edmund paused briefly before the gate, surveying the building with composed attention, as though committing its proportions and details to memory. From where I stood, I observed how his gaze traced the roofline, the alignment of windows, the subtle variations in stonework, and the pattern of footpaths leading toward neighboring houses. Nothing appeared out of place, yet I sensed that he was already forming silent impressions. We entered the garden and approached the door, our footsteps muffled by damp gravel. After a moment, the door opened quietly, revealing a woman of middle years whose expression reflected both fatigue and restraint. Her attire was modest and carefully arranged, though small signs of haste remained in the imperfect alignment of buttons and folds. She stepped aside and permitted us entry without ceremony. Inside, the house was cool and faintly scented with lavender and old wood. A narrow hallway extended inward, its walls adorned with framed landscapes whose colors had softened with age. Filtered daylight entered through high windows, casting pale patterns upon polished floors. We were guided into a sitting room at the rear of the house, where tall curtains framed a view of a small enclosed garden. The furnishings were tasteful and understated, arranged with evident care, though their arrangement suggested recent disturbance, as if certain items had been moved and then returned imperfectly to place. A small writing desk stood near the window, its surface cleared with unusual thoroughness. Nearby, a narrow bookcase held a limited but well-chosen collection of volumes, their spines aligned with precise regularity. Edmund advanced slowly into the room, allowing his presence to settle gently within the space, while I remained near the doorway, observing quietly. He removed his gloves and placed them upon a side table, then stood motionless for several seconds, absorbing the room's atmosphere before engaging more directly. His eyes moved gradually from ceiling to floor, from corners to central furnishings, tracing invisible pathways of connection. I noticed how he paused briefly beside the desk, examining its edges and the faint impressions left by objects that had recently occupied its surface. His attention then shifted to the window, where faint marks upon the sill suggested frequent opening and closing. Beyond the glass, the enclosed garden appeared undisturbed, its narrow path bordered by damp soil and low shrubs. No footprints were visible. No broken branches disturbed the symmetry. Yet something within the room conveyed quiet unrest, an absence more tangible than presence. As Edmund continued his examination, I reflected upon how different such environments were from the chaotic scenes often depicted in popular imagination. Here, there were no overturned chairs, no shattered glass, no visible struggle. Only careful order, preserved with almost excessive diligence. Such settings, I had learned, often concealed the most complex truths. After completing his initial survey, Edmund seated himself briefly in one of the armchairs, allowing his gaze to revisit each element of the room from a new perspective. From this position, he observed relationships of distance and alignment, angles of light and shadow, patterns of wear upon carpet and upholstery. The room revealed itself slowly, like a patient narrator reluctant to disclose its full story. I sensed that he was not yet prepared to form conclusions, content instead to gather impressions without judgment. The woman who had admitted us remained near the doorway, hands folded loosely, watching with composed attentiveness. Her presence, though quiet, suggested familiarity with both the room and its recent disturbances. The silence that settled among us was not uncomfortable. Rather, it possessed the quality of suspended anticipation, as though the house itself awaited interpretation. Outside, faint sounds of distant traffic and passing voices drifted intermittently through the garden, reminding us that life continued beyond these walls, indifferent to hidden concerns. Within number 27, however, time appeared temporarily suspended, held in delicate balance between past certainty and future revelation. It was here, amid polished wood and restrained elegance, that the first tangible traces of our unfolding mystery awaited careful attention. For several minutes after completing his initial survey of the sitting room, Edmund remained seated in thoughtful stillness, as though allowing the impressions he had gathered to settle gradually into coherence. The faint creak of the house, responding to shifts in temperature and light, blended softly with distant street sounds, creating a quiet backdrop against which even the smallest detail seemed amplified. From my position near the doorway, I observed how his gaze continued to travel slowly across familiar objects, revisiting them with renewed attention, as though each had acquired additional significance through repetition. At length, he rose and returned to the writing desk, approaching it with measured steps and composed posture. He examined its surface once more, this time with particular focus upon the edges and corners, where faint discolorations suggested long-term contact with hands, papers, and writing instruments. Running his gloved fingers lightly along the wood, he paused at a narrow indentation near the rear panel, barely perceptible beneath polished varnish. It appeared consistent with repeated pressure from an object of modest weight, perhaps a small box or portfolio that had occupied that space for extended periods. His attention then shifted to the chair positioned before the desk. Though aligned carefully with its frame, the chair exhibited uneven wear along one leg, as though it had been shifted frequently in subtle adjustments, perhaps to accommodate prolonged periods of sitting. The carpet beneath bore corresponding traces, its fibers slightly compressed in a narrow arc. Such marks, invisible to casual observation, suggested patterns of habitual movement. He next turned toward the bookcase. Selecting several volumes at random, he removed them gently, inspecting both spines and pages before returning them to their precise locations. One book, however, differed slightly from the others. Its cover displayed more pronounced fading, and its binding appeared looser, indicating frequent handling. Within its pages, faint creases and worn margins testified to repeated consultation. Yet its subject matter, at first glance, seemed unremarkable, consisting primarily of regional history and architectural surveys. Edmund replaced it without comment, though I sensed that it had not escaped his notice. Moving toward the window, he examined the latch mechanism and frame with careful attention. Minor scratches along the interior edge suggested regular adjustment, while subtle discoloration indicated exposure to moisture beyond ordinary condensation. The glass itself bore faint impressions, as though wiped frequently in narrow vertical strokes, perhaps to maintain a clear view of the enclosed garden below. Outside, the shrubs and narrow pathway remained undisturbed, their arrangement reflecting patient maintenance rather than recent activity. No obvious signs of intrusion presented themselves. Returning to the center of the room, Edmund directed his attention to the arrangement of furnishings. The armchairs, sofa, and side tables formed a composition both balanced and restrained, yet slight irregularities in spacing hinted at recent modification. One side table stood marginally closer to the wall than its counterpart, while a small rug beneath the coffee table had been repositioned imperfectly, its edge no longer aligned with the surrounding floorboards. These deviations, though subtle, suggested that someone had attempted to restore order after disturbance. I reflected then upon how often such efforts betrayed their own presence, for perfection, when consciously pursued, rarely matched the natural equilibrium of long-established arrangement. Edmund paused near the fireplace, examining its interior and mantel with equal diligence. The ashes had been carefully removed, and the grate polished, yet faint soot marks along the upper brickwork revealed that fires had been maintained regularly in recent weeks. A small brass ornament upon the mantel had been shifted slightly, leaving a pale outline upon the wood where it had once rested. Again, nothing dramatic presented itself, only quiet accumulation of minor deviations. After completing this circuit of observation, Edmund returned to the desk and opened his notebook. With deliberate strokes, he recorded a series of brief notations, each capturing a particular impression or anomaly. His writing remained neat and economical, reflecting disciplined thought rather than haste. I remained silent, aware that these moments of documentation often represented the invisible framework upon which later understanding would rest. As he wrote, the woman who had admitted us stood patiently near the doorway, her posture unchanged, her expression composed yet attentive. Her presence provided subtle context, suggesting familiarity with the household's usual rhythms and recent disruptions. Occasionally, her gaze followed Edmund's movements, betraying a quiet concern that she made no effort to conceal. When he finally closed his notebook, he stood motionless for a brief interval, allowing his attention to return once more to the room as a unified whole. From this vantage, individual details merged into broader patterns, and isolated observations began to suggest tentative narratives. Though he offered no immediate indication of conclusion, I sensed that the initial phase of examination was drawing to a close. The sitting room, having yielded its first impressions, now awaited deeper interpretation. Beyond its polished surfaces and restrained elegance, it concealed stories not yet spoken, preserved within traces too subtle for hurried minds to perceive. And it was within these quiet spaces, shaped by habit and memory, that the earliest foundations of truth were patiently forming. After completing his notes, Edmund remained standing near the desk, his attention directed not toward any single object, but toward the subtle relationships that connected them. The sitting room, viewed now as a unified space rather than a collection of isolated details, appeared quietly balanced, yet beneath that balance lingered faint irregularities that suggested deliberate adjustment. Such patterns, though invisible to hurried observers, often revealed themselves to patient minds willing to consider absence alongside presence. He returned once more to the bookcase and selected the volume whose worn binding had previously attracted his notice. Holding it gently, he examined its spine, edges, and cover with renewed scrutiny, as though confirming impressions formed earlier. Opening it near the center, he allowed the pages to fall naturally, observing where the binding most readily yielded. It settled upon a chapter devoted to architectural surveys of 19th-century townhouses within the Bloomsbury district. Several passages bore faint pencil markings, so light as to be almost invisible unless viewed from certain angles. Small brackets framed particular paragraphs, while discrete underlines emphasized measurements and structural features. Edmund studied these annotations in silence. Their placement was neither random nor excessive, but selective and purposeful. They suggested sustained interest in specific properties, not merely casual reading. Among the reference locations, Weatherby Crescent appeared more than once, accompanied by marginal symbols whose meaning was not immediately apparent. After recording these details, he replaced the book carefully and returned to the desk. There, he retrieved the letter once more and unfolded it with quiet deliberation. Comparing its contents to his notes, he traced certain phrases with his finger, pausing briefly at intervals where correspondence with the book's markings seemed most pronounced. Though no conclusions were yet articulated, an emerging coherence began to suggest itself through repetition. Turning his attention to the window, Edmund examined once again the view of the enclosed garden. From this angle, subtle variations in soil coloration became visible, forming faint linear patterns along the narrow path. These variations appeared consistent with recent disturbance that had since been carefully smoothed, leaving behind only minimal trace. Near the far fence, a small stone rested at an angle inconsistent with surrounding arrangement, its surface bearing faint smudges. He observed it for several moments, committing its position to memory. Returning to the center of the room, he resumed his methodical circuit, this time integrating earlier observations into a broader conceptual framework. The desk indentation, the worn book, the repositioned furnishings, the altered garden soil, and the faintly marked window frame now appeared less isolated than before. Together, they suggested deliberate, repeated activity conducted with restraint and caution. Whoever had acted within this space had done so patiently, avoiding overt disruption. The absence of chaos was itself significant. It implied familiarity. It implied intention. It implied planning. I remained quietly attentive, sensing that these realizations were assembling gradually within his mind, forming the earliest contours of understanding. No outward sign marked this internal process, save for occasional stillness and subtle shifts in focus. Edmund then returned to his notebook and added several new entries beneath earlier remarks. These additions were longer than previous ones, reflecting developing hypotheses rather than simple observation. Each line was written with measured clarity, suggesting careful consideration rather than speculation. When he finished, he closed the notebook and placed it beside the letter. For several moments, he stood motionless, allowing the assembled impressions to resonate without interference. The room, unchanged in appearance, now carried deeper significance through accumulated interpretation. Even its quiet seemed newly weighted. I reflected then upon how truth rarely presented itself in sudden revelation. More often, it emerged through convergence, as disparate fragments gradually aligned into discernible form. In this case, the convergence appeared to revolve around sustained interest in the house itself, its structure, its access points, and its concealed spaces. The letter, though cryptic, seemed increasingly connected to these physical realities. It was no longer an isolated communication. It was part of a larger narrative. When Edmund finally turned toward the doorway, his expression remained composed, yet his posture suggested quiet resolve. The preliminary phase of inquiry had reached sufficient maturity to justify further engagement beyond observation. The next steps would require movement, inquiry, and patient extension of these emerging patterns into the wider world. Outside, distant sounds drifted faintly through the garden, reminding us that time continued its steady passage. Within number 27, however, understanding had begun its slow ascent, guided by attention, memory, and disciplined thought. After concluding his examination of the sitting room, Edmund gathered his notebook and gloves, returning them carefully to their accustomed places, as though closing one chapter before proceeding to the next. The quiet of number 27 had grown familiar during our stay, yet it now seemed to carry subtle undertones, as though layers of past activity lingered faintly within its walls. We remained in the room for several minutes longer, allowing impressions to settle, before Edmund turned his attention toward the adjoining hallway. With unhurried steps, he proceeded toward the rear of the house, pausing occasionally to observe door frames, stair rails, and narrow corners where shadows gathered. Each surface bore the subtle imprint of prolonged use, revealing patterns of movement that reflected daily habits and private routines. The corridor led us toward a small study situated between the sitting room and the kitchen. Its door stood partially open, admitting a narrow beam of filtered light that illuminated a writing table and several stacked folders arranged with careful symmetry. The air within carried a faint scent of ink and dried parchment, suggesting that this space had once served as a center of quiet industry. Edmund entered first, allowing his presence to register gently within the confined room before approaching its contents. The writing table exhibited signs of prolonged use, its surface marked by faint scratches and softened edges where hands had rested repeatedly. A small drawer beneath contained neatly organized stationery, envelopes, and sealing wax, all aligned with deliberate precision. Several sheets of paper, though blank, bore faint impressions from previous writing, indicating that correspondence had been composed here with regularity. Along the far wall stood a narrow cabinet whose shelves contained ledgers, folded documents, and bound notebooks of varying size and age. Their arrangement suggested both chronological order and thematic grouping, reflecting a systematic mind accustomed to preserving records. Edmund examined these volumes with restrained interest, selecting several for closer inspection before returning them to their positions. One ledger, however, appeared more frequently handled than the others. Its spine showed greater wear, and its cover displayed subtle discoloration from repeated contact. Opening it carefully, he revealed pages filled with meticulous entries concerning household expenses, maintenance records, and occasional notations regarding property modifications. These entries extended back over several years, forming a quiet chronicle of the house's material life. Interspersed among these practical records were occasional references to structural inspections, repairs to concealed piping, and alterations to interior partitions. Such details, while mundane in isolation, acquired greater significance in light of earlier observations. They suggested sustained attention to the building's internal composition. Returning the ledger to its shelf, Edmund directed his focus toward a small framed photograph resting upon the writing table. It depicted a younger version of the house's former occupants standing beside the garden gate, accompanied by two indistinct figures whose faces had faded with time. Though the image offered little explicit information, its placement within the study suggested personal importance. Nearby, a narrow drawer contained several folded letters bound with ribbon. Their paper bore signs of age, and their seals had long since been broken. Edmund examined these briefly, noting dates and locations before returning them with careful respect. None appeared directly connected to recent events, yet collectively they revealed patterns of correspondence extending beyond immediate social circles. As he completed his survey of the study, he paused near the doorway and regarded the room as a whole. From this vantage, individual elements merged into a cohesive narrative of disciplined record-keeping and private reflection. The space appeared to have served not merely as an office, but as a repository of memory and intention. I reflected upon how often such rooms preserved silent testimony long after voices had faded. They contained the residue of decisions, concerns, and aspirations, encoded within paper and arrangement. Edmund then turned his attention toward the staircase leading to the upper floor. Its banister bore the smooth polish of frequent contact, while its steps displayed subtle variations in wear. Ascending slowly, he observed these details with characteristic attentiveness, as though tracing the rhythms of countless prior movements. At the landing, we paused briefly, allowing our senses to adjust to the softer light and narrower corridors above. Here, the atmosphere felt more intimate, shaped by personal routines rather than formal presentation. bedrooms and private chambers extended along the hallway, their closed doors preserving stories yet untold. Edmund surveyed this space in silence, aware that the house's deeper history lay embedded within these upper rooms. The echoes of former days lingered here more distinctly, woven into wood, fabric, and shadow. And it was among these quiet remnants of past lives that the next fragments of our unfolding mystery awaited discovery. The upper corridor of number 27 extended before us in gentle perspective, its walls painted in muted tones that reflected softened daylight from narrow windows overlooking the garden. A long carpet runner stretched along the floor, its pattern faded by years of careful passage, while framed sketches and landscapes adorned the walls at measured intervals, suggesting deliberate selection rather than random decoration. The atmosphere differed noticeably from that of the lower rooms. Here, the formality of reception and display gave way to personal routine and private reflection, and every surface seemed to carry traces of long-established habit. Edmund advanced slowly along the corridor, pausing occasionally before closed doors as though sensing the distinct character contained within each. He selected the first door on the right and opened it with quiet restraint. The room beyond revealed itself as a modest guest chamber, furnished with a narrow bed, a small writing desk, and a wardrobe of polished oak. Light filtered through lace curtains, casting delicate patterns upon pale walls and neatly arranged linens. Everything appeared carefully maintained, though signs of infrequent use were evident in the slight stiffness of fabric and the absence of personal belongings. Edmund surveyed the chamber methodically, examining drawer interiors, wardrobe shelves, and the underside of the writing desk. No irregularities presented themselves. The room seemed preserved more as a formality than as an actively occupied space. He closed the door gently and proceeded onward. The second chamber proved more intimate in character. A wider bed occupied its center, accompanied by bedside tables bearing reading lamps and small decorative objects. A narrow bookshelf held several volumes of poetry and philosophy, their pages softened by repeated handling. Near the window, a cushioned chair faced outward, positioned to receive afternoon light. Here, the signs of personal presence were more apparent. Subtle impressions upon the mattress suggested habitual patterns of rest. A faint indentation marked the carpet where the chair had been shifted repeatedly. The wardrobe contained garments arranged with quiet care, reflecting an orderly temperament. Edmund examined these elements with composed interest, noting both presence and absence with equal attention. A small jewelry box rested upon one table, its interior lined with pale velvet. It contained only a few modest pieces, none of notable value, yet each had been preserved with evident consideration. Their arrangement suggested selective attachment rather than casual accumulation. After completing his inspection, Edmund closed the box and returned it precisely to its former position. We moved onward to the principal bedchamber at the end of the corridor. This room, larger than the others, received abundant light through tall windows that overlooked both garden and street. Heavy curtains framed the openings, their fabric darkened slightly by age yet carefully maintained. The furnishings were substantial but restrained, reflecting both comfort and discipline. A writing desk stood near one window, accompanied by a high-backed chair whose upholstery bore signs of prolonged use. Several framed certificates and photographs adorned the walls, offering glimpses of professional and personal milestones. Edmund approached the desk first. Its surface was partially cleared, though faint impressions indicated that documents and instruments had recently occupied specific locations. One drawer, slightly misaligned, required gentle pressure to close fully. Inside, we discovered neatly stacked papers, tied with ribbon and categorized by date. Many concerned property affairs, investments, and correspondence with surveyors and contractors. Again, structural matters appeared prominently among personal records. The wardrobe contained clothing of consistent style and subdued color, suggesting preference for restraint over display. Footwear arranged beneath reflected regular maintenance, though one pair exhibited noticeably greater wear, indicating frequent outdoor use. Near the bed, a small bedside cabinet held a leather-bound journal. Its cover bore softened edges and faint scratches from repeated handling. Edmund opened it carefully and scanned several pages. The entries, written in precise script, documented daily routines, reflections on health, and occasional remarks concerning household modifications. Certain passages referenced concealed spaces, ventilation channels, and access routes within the building, though without elaboration. These remarks, while sparse, aligned with patterns observed elsewhere. Returning the journal to its place, Edmund stood quietly for several moments, allowing the accumulated impressions of multiple rooms to merge. From guest chamber to private study, from correspondence to journal entries, a consistent theme emerged. The former occupant had devoted sustained attention to the physical structure of his residence beyond ordinary maintenance. This interest appeared neither casual nor temporary. It had persisted for years. As we concluded our examination of the upper floor, I reflected upon how personal spaces often revealed more than formal rooms ever could. Here, in bedrooms and private chambers, intentions and preoccupations left their most enduring traces. And within these quiet rooms of memory, the foundations of deeper understanding were steadily taking shape. After completing our survey of the upper chambers, Edmund remained for several moments at the end of the corridor, his gaze traveling slowly along doors, frames, and narrow recesses, as though listening for echoes not of sound, but of past activity. The softened light filtering through high windows illuminated subtle variations in wall texture and floorboard alignment, revealing small imperfections that often betrayed later modification. Such details, while easily overlooked, formed an essential part of the house's silent testimony. With deliberate calm, Edmund knelt near one section of the corridor wall where the paneling appeared marginally misaligned. Running his gloved fingers along its surface, he detected faint differences in resistance and temperature, suggesting variations in material density beneath. These irregularities indicated that certain sections had been altered at some point, likely in response to practical necessity rather than aesthetic preference. He rose and proceeded toward a narrow storage closet at the far end of the hall. Its door opened upon shelves containing folded linens, spare lamps, and carefully labeled boxes. Everything appeared orderly, yet the depth of the shelves seemed inconsistent, with one section extending farther inward than the others. Edmund examined this area closely, measuring distances by eye and tracing the outlines of boards with patient attention. Behind a stack of folded blankets, he located a removable panel secured by discrete fastenings. It blended seamlessly with surrounding woodwork, revealing itself only through meticulous inspection. With controlled pressure, he loosened its fittings and eased it aside. Beyond lay a shallow recess, its interior surfaces coated with fine dust and faint discoloration. The space extended laterally, forming a narrow passage between interior walls. Its purpose was not immediately apparent, yet its existence alone suggested deliberate concealment. Using the small lamp he carried, Edmund illuminated the recess. Within its confined dimensions, faint marks upon the floor indicated periodic access, while slight abrasions along the walls revealed the passage of objects through limited space. No contents remained within. Whatever had once occupied this passage had been removed with care. He replaced the panel temporarily and returned to the corridor. Continuing his examination, Edmund directed attention toward the staircase banister. Along its underside, subtle variations in finish suggested sections that had been refinished independently, perhaps after partial dismantling. Nearby, one stair creaked more noticeably than its neighbors, responding with delayed resonance to pressure. Beneath it, faint scratches hinted at previous adjustment. Descending slowly, he examined the area beneath the staircase, where a small cupboard concealed cleaning supplies and unused furnishings. Its back wall, however, bore signs of reconstruction, with boards of slightly differing grain and color forming an imperfect mosaic. He inspected this surface carefully, confirming that it concealed another shallow cavity. Again, the space lay empty. No documents, no objects, no visible remnants. Only absence. Returning to the sitting room, Edmund paused near the fireplace, contemplating its structure with renewed interest. He examined the stonework surrounding the hearth, noting minor discrepancies in alignment and mortar coloration. One narrow section responded differently to pressure, suggesting concealed reinforcement. Removing a small decorative panel, he revealed a narrow compartment extending upward behind the chimney structure. It too was vacant. At this point, a pattern became unmistakable. Throughout the house, concealed spaces existed, integrated seamlessly into walls, stairs, and fixtures. Each had been carefully constructed. Each had been regularly accessed. Each had been deliberately emptied. The consistency of this design indicated long-term planning rather than impulsive improvisation. These spaces had served a purpose. That purpose had now concluded. I reflected upon how such architecture mirrored human intention, translating private concerns into physical form. Hidden chambers reflected hidden priorities. Concealed passages suggested the movement of information, objects, or resources meant to escape ordinary observation. Yet without their contents, interpretation remained incomplete. Edmund recorded these findings with steady precision, documenting locations, dimensions, and construction methods. His notes formed a quiet map of invisible pathways embedded within ordinary living space. When he finally closed his notebook, he stood silently near the center of the room, surveying once more the outwardly unremarkable surroundings. Beneath polished floors and carefully arranged furnishings lay a network of secrecy, patiently crafted and meticulously erased. The house, once perceived as merely reserved and orderly, now revealed itself as an instrument of concealment. And within its quiet walls, the outlines of a far more complex story were steadily emerging. After completing his examination of the concealed spaces within number 27, Edmund remained for some time near the fireplace, allowing the significance of his discoveries to settle gradually into coherent understanding. The sitting room, outwardly unchanged, now appeared subtly transformed through awareness of its hidden architecture, revealing layers of intention beneath surfaces once perceived as merely decorative. Only when his notes had been reviewed and adjusted with quiet precision did he prepare to extend his inquiry beyond the confines of the house. He retrieved his gloves and coat, donning them with habitual care, and directed his attention toward the front entrance. The transition from interior reflection to external observation occurred without ceremony, marked only by the gentle opening of the door and the soft rush of cool air into the hallway. Outside, Weatherby Crescent lay bathed in pale daylight, its elegance preserved by orderly gardens and discreet facades. The earlier mist had lifted, leaving behind clean lines and softened shadows. Passers-by moved at unhurried pace, absorbed in their own affairs, unaware of the quiet investigation unfolding among them. Edmund paused briefly upon the threshold, surveying the street with composed attentiveness. His gaze followed the curvature of the crescent, noting sightlines, angles of approach, and positions of concealment. Each doorway, each hedge, each lamppost contributed silently to an invisible map of movement and observation. We proceeded slowly along the pavement, maintaining an appearance of casual promenade. Yet beneath this outward calm, Edmund's attention remained finely attuned to subtle variations in surface and structure. Near the garden gate, he examined the latch mechanism, noting faint abrasions consistent with frequent adjustment. Along the fence line, certain sections displayed marginal displacement, suggesting occasional pressure applied from within. These minor deviations indicated regular interaction with boundaries designed to appear static. Further along, he paused beside a public bench overlooking the crescent. Its wooden slats bore faint scratches and indentations, consistent with repeated placement of small objects. Nearby paving stones exhibited subtle discoloration, likely caused by prolonged contact with moisture and residue from footwear. Such traces, though commonplace in urban environments, acquired greater significance when considered in context. At the corner where Weatherby Crescent joined a narrower side street, Edmund examined the junction carefully. Here, architectural density increased, creating natural pockets of shadow and limited visibility. From this position, portions of number 27's garden and rear windows were partially observable. The location offered discrete opportunity for prolonged surveillance. He lingered briefly, allowing impressions to consolidate. Continuing onward, we passed several neighboring residences. Each presented similar outward appearance, yet minor variations in upkeep and arrangement reflected differing patterns of occupancy. One house displayed particularly meticulous maintenance, its pathways swept and hedges trimmed with exceptional regularity. Its upper windows, however, remained partially obscured by heavy curtains. Edmund noted this quietly before moving on. Near the far end of the crescent, a small service alley provided access to rear courtyards and delivery entrances. Here, the atmosphere shifted perceptibly. Stone walls bore heavier markings. Ground surfaces showed irregular wear. Discarded crates and containers rested in loosely organized stacks. This space suggested frequent, unrecorded activity beyond formal entrances. Edmund examined the alley's layout carefully, tracing potential routes between properties. Several narrow passages converged here, forming a network of informal transit invisible from main thoroughfares. Such configurations often facilitated discrete movement. After completing his circuit, Edmund returned gradually toward number 27. As we walked, I reflected upon how urban landscapes preserved histories of use and adaptation within their most ordinary features. Every worn step, displaced stone, and altered latch recorded silent narratives of human intention. Back at the front gate, Edmund paused once more. He surveyed the residence with renewed perspective, integrating interior findings with external context. Hidden chambers, altered pathways, and subtle surveillance points now formed interconnected elements within a broader framework. The house no longer stood in isolation. It occupied a position within a carefully navigated environment. When we re-entered the sitting room, the atmosphere felt subtly altered. The mystery had expanded beyond walls and furnishings into the surrounding streets. Its boundaries were no longer defined solely by architecture. They now encompass patterns of movement, observation, and access woven into the fabric of the neighborhood itself. And with this widening perspective, the path toward deeper understanding began its next quiet ascent. After returning from our measured circuit of Weatherby Crescent, Edmund settled once more near the desk in the sitting room, arranging his notes with characteristic order before resuming his contemplative posture. The afternoon light, now softened by passing clouds, filtered gently through the windows and settled upon books, furniture, and paper, lending the room an atmosphere of subdued reflection. Outside, distant sounds of commerce and conversation drifted faintly through the garden, reminding us that beyond these quiet walls, countless lives continued their steady course. Within our small domain, however, attention remained focused upon subtle networks of association gradually emerging from accumulated observation. Edmund reviewed his notebook slowly, revisiting earlier entries and adding occasional marginal symbols whose meaning was known only to himself. These markings, I had learned, represented evolving assessments rather than fixed conclusions. They signaled relationships under consideration, possibilities awaiting confirmation. After completing this review, he directed his attention toward a modest stack of correspondence retrieved earlier from the study. Sorting the letters by date and origin, he examined their postmarks, paper quality, and handwriting with composed diligence. Though many proved routine in nature, several bore distinctive characteristics that invited closer scrutiny. One series of envelopes originated consistently from the same district near the southern docks. Their stamps, though ordinary, displayed subtle variations in cancellation patterns, suggesting dispatch from multiple collection points within limited geographic range. Another group bore addresses written in a precise, formal hand, distinct from that of other correspondence. These letters frequently reference technical matters and logistical arrangements, though without explicit detail. Edmund recorded these distinctions carefully. He then turned his attention toward public directories and municipal records, selecting several volumes from the shelves and arranging them upon the desk. With practiced efficiency, he consulted property registries, maintenance permits, and historical zoning documents, tracing patterns of ownership and modification related to number 27. Over time, a small constellation of names emerged, recurring across various records. Some were associated with construction firms, others with surveying offices. A few appeared connected to import and storage facilities near the river. Individually, these references seemed inconsequential. Collectively, they suggested coordinated interaction. I observed how Edmund assembled these fragments into tentative networks, noting proximity, overlap, and duration. He remained careful to distinguish between correlation and causation, recording possibilities without elevating them prematurely to certainty. Such restraint, I had learned, protected inquiry from distortion. Late in the afternoon, he directed his attention towards social registers and membership lists preserved within several private publications. These sources documented affiliations with professional societies, charitable organizations, and discrete clubs whose activities remained largely internal. Within these pages, several familiar names reappeared, now situated within broader circles of association. Certain individuals connected to property management also appeared within maritime committees. Others linked to engineering consultancies participated in philanthropic boards. These overlapping memberships formed quiet bridges between disparate domains. Edmund noted these intersections with composed interest. As daylight gradually waned, he shifted focus toward more recent records. Local periodicals and archived notices provided additional context. Announcements of minor infrastructure projects, scheduled inspections, and temporary closures appeared at regular intervals, often coinciding with periods of documented activity at number 27. Such synchronization suggested deliberate coordination. Throughout this process, Edmund maintained an atmosphere of calm concentration. There were no gestures of excitement or frustration, only steady accumulation, only patient refinement. I reflected then upon how investigations often resembled the construction of intricate maps, each observation serving as a coordinate rather than a destination. Truth, in such endeavors, emerged not through dramatic revelation, but through gradual alignment. As evening approached, Edmund closed several volumes and returned them to their shelves. He gathered remaining papers into neat stacks and secured them with ribbon. The desk, once crowded with sources, resumed its orderly appearance. Yet beneath this restored simplicity lay an expanded understanding of human connections surrounding the house. Hidden chambers and altered pathways had pointed toward intentional design. Correspondence and records now revealed the social and professional networks that sustained that design. The mystery had shifted once more, moving from physical concealment toward relational complexity. Within these quiet circles of connection, motives and opportunities intertwined. And somewhere within their intersections, the next layer of truth awaited discovery. As evening settled gradually over Ravenscroft Lane, the sitting room assumed once more its familiar character of quiet refuge and thoughtful repose. Shadows lengthened across bookshelves and walls, while the soft glow of lamps replaced fading daylight with warmer tones. Outside, the city resumed its nocturnal rhythm, marked by distant carriage wheels, muted conversations, and the occasional echo of footsteps upon damp stone. Within this gently shifting atmosphere, Edmund returned to his notes with renewed attentiveness. He arranged them into several small groupings, each representing a particular category of association, before examining their interrelations with composed focus. From this methodical process, one cluster began to distinguish itself through frequency and consistency. Several documents, letters, and registry entries converged repeatedly upon a single individual whose involvement spanned multiple domains. This name appeared in property assessments, maritime committee records, engineering consultations, and philanthropic accounts. Its recurrence was neither sporadic nor coincidental. Rather, it reflected sustained participation across interconnected spheres. Edmund traced these references carefully, noting dates, locations, and contexts. Gradually, a portrait began to form, composed not of physical description, but of professional trajectory and social engagement. The individual had maintained a reputation for discretion, reliability, and technical competence. Public records portrayed him as diligent and unremarkable. Private correspondence suggested deeper involvement in specialized projects requiring confidentiality. Further examination revealed that he had served periodically as intermediary between contractors, inspectors, and logistical coordinators. Such a role placed him in proximity to both planning and execution. It also afforded access to restricted information. Edmund consulted additional directories and archival indexes, confirming that this figure had resided intermittently within walking distance of Weatherby Crescent during critical periods of renovation and inspection. property leases, though short-term, overlapped with documented modifications to number 27. This proximity strengthened emerging patterns. Late in the evening, he retrieved a small notebook reserved for personal profiles. Within it, he began to assemble a preliminary account of the individual's activities. Each entry remained carefully qualified, marked by conditional phrasing and contextual references. Assumptions were avoided. Only verifiable connections were recorded. From these accumulated fragments, a coherent outline emerged. The individual had facilitated structural alterations under legitimate authorization. He had maintained relationships with shipping and storage firms. He had participated in charitable initiatives that provided plausible cover for irregular scheduling. He had corresponded discreetly with multiple parties involved in property management. None of these facts, taken alone, implied wrongdoing. Together, however, they suggested exceptional opportunity. Opportunity to observe. Opportunity to coordinate. Opportunity to conceal. I reflected upon how frequently such figures remained overlooked precisely because of their outward normalcy. They occupied positions of quiet trust, operating within accepted frameworks while navigating unseen corridors of influence. Their visibility protected them. Their reliability rendered them inconspicuous. As Edmund completed this profile, he returned briefly to the original letter. Comparing its phrasing with expressions found in recent correspondence, he noted subtle stylistic similarities. Certain turns of phrase, patterns of punctuation, and structural tendencies aligned closely. These parallels were too consistent to ignore. They did not establish identity. They suggested familiarity. Late that night, Edmund placed a discreet mark beside the assembled profile. It was neither affirmation nor conclusion. It represented provisional significance, a recognition that among many connections, one had begun to assume particular relevance. The mystery, once diffused across architecture and networks, now possessed a tentative focal point. A name had taken shape, not yet as accusation, not yet as certainty, but as a guidepost for subsequent inquiry. And within that emerging focus, the next stage of understanding awaited its quiet unfolding. The following morning arrived beneath a veil of pale cloud, softening the contours of rooftops and chimneys and lending the city an atmosphere of quiet restraint. Light filtered gradually through narrow gaps between buildings, settling upon streets and pavements with gentle persistence. Within our sitting room, the familiar rituals of preparation unfolded without haste, guided by habit and unspoken coordination. Edmund reviewed his notes one final time, selecting several pages and arranging them within his coat with deliberate care. His movements suggested neither anticipation nor reluctance, only calm readiness. After ensuring that all essential materials were secured, he extinguished the lamp, and we departed Ravenscroft Lane in composed silence. Our destination lay within a modest commercial district not far from the river, where offices, workshops, and storage facilities coexisted in restrained proximity. The journey proceeded at unhurried pace, allowing us to observe the gradual transformation of architecture and activity as residential streets yielded to areas shaped by trade and transit. Upon arrival, we entered a narrow thoroughfare bordered by brick buildings whose facades bore signs of prolonged exposure to weather and labor. Windows were protected by iron grills, and doorways displayed layers of faded paint accumulated over decades. The atmosphere here differed markedly from that of Weatherby Crescent, carrying undertones of persistent movement and quiet industry. Edmund paused briefly at the corner of the street, surveying entrances, signboards, and pedestrian flow. His attention lingered upon one modest office situated above a small shipping agency. Its windows were partially obscured by thin curtains, and its brass nameplate reflected subdued light. We ascended a narrow staircase and entered the reception area, which consisted of a single room furnished with a desk, several chairs, and shelves containing orderly files. A clerk occupied the desk, engaged in methodical documentation. Our presence was acknowledged with polite restraint. Edmund conducted his inquiry through established channels, requesting access to specific records under appropriate pretext. Documentation was produced with quiet efficiency. No irregularities were apparent in procedure. While these formalities unfolded, I observed the surroundings with gentle curiosity. Walls bore framed certificates and faded photographs of cargo vessels and dockside gatherings. A calendar displayed shipping schedules marked by neat annotations. Everything suggested disciplined routine. After completing his review of the records, Edmund requested brief consultation with the individual whose name had emerged from prior research. This request was transmitted discreetly. After a short interval, we were escorted to a private office at the rear of the building. The room was modest in size, furnished with a writing desk, filing cabinets, and a narrow window overlooking a side alley. Light entered reluctantly, filtered through grime and shadow. The individual awaited us within. He appeared of middle age, with features shaped more by attentiveness than by physical labor. His attire was practical and well-maintained, reflecting professional pride rather than display. His posture conveyed composure, and his manner suggested habitual engagement with administrative responsibilities. The meeting unfolded with restrained formality. Edmund maintained a courteous demeanor, directing conversation along established topics of documentation, compliance, and logistical coordination. No direct reference to sensitive matters occurred. No explicit inquiry was voiced. Instead, attention focused upon consistency, chronology, and minor procedural details. Throughout this exchange, the individual responded with steady clarity, offering information aligned with official records and public documentation. There were no visible signs of evasion or discomfort. Yet beneath this surface of professionalism, subtle variations in emphasis and phrasing suggested careful self-monitoring. Certain topics were addressed with particular precision. Others received more general treatment. Edmund observed these nuances without comment. As the meeting concluded, courteous expressions were exchanged, and administrative routines resumed without disruption. We departed the building quietly and returned to the street. Outside, activity continued uninterrupted. Carts passed. Workers conversed. Deliveries proceeded. Nothing marked our visit as unusual. Yet as we walked away, I sensed that this unremarkable encounter had provided essential calibration. It had neither confirmed nor refuted emerging hypotheses. It had established behavioral context. It had supplied reference against which future observations could be measured. The individual remained, for now, an unresolved figure, neither implicated nor absolved. But within the delicate balance of his responses lay subtle indicators that would later assume greater significance. And so, without confrontation or declaration, another fragment of the mystery had been quietly secured. Upon returning to Ravenscroft Lane, we resumed our customary silence, allowing impressions from the morning's encounter to settle gradually without premature interpretation. The familiar warmth of our sitting room, sustained by a modest fire and softly glowing lamps, offered a natural transition from outward observation to inward reflection. Outside, late afternoon clouds drifted slowly across the sky, filtering sunlight into muted tones that complemented the subdued atmosphere within. Edmund removed his coat and gloves and placed them carefully upon their accustomed hooks before returning to the desk. There, he unfolded his notebook and reviewed the most recent entries, integrating observations from the meeting with previously assembled records. Certain notations were adjusted. Others were expanded. Several were marked for further verification. This methodical refinement reflected his commitment to precision over assumption. After completing this review, he directed his attention toward a small wooden cabinet beneath the bookshelf. Its contents, largely neglected during earlier stages of inquiry, consisted of miscellaneous documents and items retrieved from secondary storage spaces within number 27. These materials had been collected during initial examinations but set aside pending clearer context. Now, with broader understanding established, their significance could be reassessed. He unlocked the cabinet and removed several shallow trays containing envelopes, folded papers, and wrapped parcels. Each was arranged chronologically according to estimated origin. Selecting the earliest tray, he began to examine its contents with renewed care. Among these items were maintenance invoices, unsigned receipts, and fragments of correspondence whose relevance had previously seemed limited. Yet when reviewed alongside emerging patterns, new relationships became apparent. Several invoices referenced specialized materials uncommon in routine household repairs. Certain receipts indicated payment structures inconsistent with standard contracting practices. Most notable, however, was a narrow bundle of folded papers bound by faded twine. Its contents consisted of hand-drawn diagrams depicting interior wall sections, stairwell cross-sections, and ventilation channels. These sketches, though executed with modest artistic skill, displayed technical accuracy. Measurements were precise. Annotations were systematic. Dates inscribed in the margins corresponded closely with documented periods of renovation. Edmund examined these diagrams carefully, comparing them with his own notes and with structural features observed throughout the house. The correspondence was striking. They confirmed not only the existence of concealed passages, but also their original design and intended use. Further inspection revealed several letters enclosed within the same bundle. Their language was cautious and indirect, emphasizing coordination, discretion, and timing. Specific locations were referenced through coded terminology. Delivery schedules were discussed in abstract terms. Authorization was implied rather than stated. These communications, though lacking explicit confession, conveyed operational intent. Another parcel contained ledgers distinct from those examined earlier. These volumes documented transactions involving storage facilities, transport services, and intermediary agents. Entries were carefully structured to obscure direct linkage between sender and recipient. Nevertheless, repeated patterns emerged. Routes, dates, and quantities aligned consistently with periods of heightened activity at number 27. Edmund organized these findings into parallel sequences, aligning diagrams, correspondence, and transaction records. Gradually, a cohesive narrative began to emerge. The house had functioned as a controlled node within a broader logistical network. Concealed spaces facilitated temporary storage. Discrete access routes enabled movement. Professional contacts ensured procedural legitimacy. Charitable and commercial activities provided plausible cover. The individual previously identified had operated within this framework as coordinator and facilitator. His role, though outwardly administrative, had enabled structural and logistical integration. These revelations did not introduce sudden certainty. Rather, they refined probability. They reduced ambiguity. They transformed speculation into substantiated inference. As dusk settled beyond the windows, Edmund completed his synthesis. He secured the documents within labeled folders and returned them to the cabinet, now reorganized according to analytical priority. The once miscellaneous collection had become a structured archive. I reflected upon how easily such materials might have remained overlooked without patient contextualization. Separated, they appeared innocuous. Together, they revealed purpose. The investigation, having traversed architecture, networks, and individuals, had now converged upon documented process. The hidden systems within number 27 were no longer merely theoretical. They were substantiated by preserved intent. And within this accumulating clarity, the final stage of understanding awaited careful articulation. The final stage of understanding unfolded without ceremony, shaped not by confrontation or public spectacle, but by the gradual alignment of accumulated evidence and the patient confirmation of each detail through established and reliable channels. In the days that followed our review of the concealed materials, Edmund continued his work with the same composed diligence that had guided every earlier phase of the inquiry, verifying correspondence, cross-referencing records, and refining timelines with careful restraint, ensuring that every conclusion rested upon substantiated foundations rather than isolated inference. Throughout this period, our sitting room once more served as both sanctuary and workspace, where morning light illuminated orderly stacks of documents, evening lamps softened their edges, and the familiar rhythm of fire and rain accompanied the steady movement of thought. Within this stable environment, complexity yielded gradually to clarity, and uncertainty gave way to measured understanding. It became evident that the house on Weatherby Crescent had functioned for years as a discrete transit and coordination point within a broader network of unauthorized logistical activity, its concealed passages and compartments enabling temporary storage and controlled transfer of sensitive materials, while structural modifications, legitimate in appearance, had been designed to facilitate systematic concealment. Professional relationships ensured access to permits, inspections, and transport services without arousing suspicion, and social credibility provided a protective layer of apparent normalcy. The individual previously identified had operated as central intermediary within this framework, sustaining integration across multiple domains through administrative authority and carefully maintained reputation, while remaining insulated from direct operational exposure. Financial records, correspondence, and technical diagrams confirmed his coordination of structural adaptations, scheduling of movements, and management of documentation, revealing a pattern of sustained and deliberate organization. When regulatory authorities were quietly provided with consolidated documentation, their response unfolded with measured discretion, proceeding through formal audits, administrative reviews, and contractual reassessments that gradually restricted operational capacity without provoking public disturbance. Licenses were examined, permits reconsidered, and financial relationships scrutinized with procedural rigor, resulting in the steady dissolution of the network's functional mechanisms. By the time formal proceedings commenced, most activities had already ceased, their infrastructure rendered inactive through systematic oversight. The individual in question responded with outward cooperation, submitting records and statements in accordance with institutional requirements, yet the accumulated documentation rendered his professional position untenable, leading ultimately to the revocation of privileges, imposition of financial liabilities, and subsequent legal accountability within established frameworks. No headlines announced these developments, and no crowds gathered to witness them, for resolution arrived quietly, as such matters often do when guided by patience rather than spectacle. Number 27 underwent subsequent renovation under transparent supervision, during which concealed structures were dismantled, irregular modifications removed, and interior spaces restored to ordinary domestic function, transforming what had once served as an instrument of secrecy into a documented chapter of architectural history. In time, new occupants arrived, gardens were replanted, windows reopened, and curtains replaced, allowing life to resume its gentle and uninterrupted course. On an evening several weeks later, as rain once again traced delicate patterns upon our windows and firelight flickered softly across familiar furnishings, Edmund and I sat beside the hearth in reflective stillness, our notebooks closed, our desks cleared, and the atmosphere of inquiry replaced by quiet repose. I reflected then upon how the letter that had arrived in fog and silence had initiated a chain of subtle revelations, unfolding not through dramatic confrontation, but through accumulation, restraint, and disciplined attention. No singular moment had defined success, and no climactic revelation had announced resolution, yet balance had been restored, order reaffirmed, and uncertainty transformed into understanding. Such conclusions rarely satisfied popular imagination, lacking spectacle and emotional excess, yet they preserved continuity, stability, and trust in measured process. Edmund remained seated near the flames, his gaze resting upon their slow movement, much as it had on the evening when the letter first arrived, his posture reflecting neither triumph nor fatigue, but only calm continuity and quiet dedication. Another story had concluded, another fragment of hidden complexity had been rendered transparent, and beyond our windows London continued its steady rhythm, indifferent to resolved mysteries and forgotten secrets. Within our quiet rooms, however, memory preserved their outlines, and in that preservation lay the enduring purpose of attentive inquiry, not to dazzle, not to dominate, but to understand.